Thank you for that remarkably generous introduction. And I just have to say before I begin, a shout out to the art history program here, because I have never seen a program that does so much with so little and does it so well. So congratulations to you. I mean that. Over the last 30 years, the human subject has become increasingly particularized, concentrated into a specific social body, the materialized node of multiple and telling differences in gender and race and sexuality, social class, and now increasingly a series of other differences, subsidiary differences like physical size, geography, ability, even religion. Being, as we understand it today, now accrues meaning largely through difference. And the body condenses an increasingly three-dimensional picture of the social into what we now understand much more simply as our identity. But as eagerly as we now try to differentiate ourselves from others, the cultural moment immediately preceding our current embrace of the dissimilar was committed, I'm going to be arguing, to the polar opposite, even to the point of attempting to erase embodied physical differences. Here's Carolee Schneemann, I'm about to show you the film, describing one of her earliest attempts to transcend physical gender in her 1964 film, Fuses. I quote her, "I edited the sequences," she says, "so that whenever you were looking at the male genital, it would dissolve into the female, and vice versa. The viewer's unconscious attitude would be constantly challenged. You couldn't start to say, 'That's disgusting,' or 'I love that,' before it became its equivalent. I wanted everything to suddenly drain into this open, indecipherable whiteness, like this orgasmic space where you are out beyond wherever you are," end quote. Fuses essentially figures explicit shots of the artist having sex with her male partner. By definition, few images are as gendered and as normatively sexed as explicit heterosexual intercourse. Yet Schneemann layered the images, cut them, dipped them in acid, and otherwise manipulated the film, such that, as she notes, right, representations of gender and sexual difference move in and out of pure abstraction, attaining a state of an ecstatic out beyond. As she put it in another interview, Fuses is both a sensuous and equitable interchange. Neither lover is the subject or the object. Through the erotics of the film, Schneemann sought an interchangeability of seductive identifications and a loss of an essentialized subjectivity in its most intensified state, sexual arousal. An erotics that loses the specificity of the body in and through the body's specificity. I'll be arguing that in such a state, there's nothing foreign about lesbianism or gayness or heterosexuality or any of our countless other ways of dividing up desire. A utopian dream of the utility of the sexual towards the attainment of an unboundaried human freedom. This instrumentalization of desire as a political platform is, of course, nothing new. You need only look at contemporary politics. But what makes it unfamiliar is its converse trajectory. Desire not as the tightening, but the loosening of identity, as a bridge across our differences. Why is that not playing? Sorry. It would not be art history if it was not technical difficulties. Here you can see all the manipulations. And I want you to pay particular attention. You're hearing the waves because it begins at the ocean. Pay particular attention to how that looks like a female body, like a traditional odalisque. Female body, female body, female body, dick. Right? So immediately you're like, whoa. And that's what I mean. That's the kind of play that Schneemann is going for here. Hardly idiosyncratic, that's just a little piece of the film. Hardly idiosyncratic. In fact, the use of the erotic towards the destructuring of so-called natural distinctions is part and parcel of a larger cultural discourse that gained strength roughly between 1955 and 1969, though it has almost completely escaped critical notice. In no small measure because of its enormous differences from the way we understand and classify gender and sexuality today. As a kind of shorthand, this attitude was cast, and this was the word that was repeatedly used, as Eros, after the term made famous by the German philosopher who moved to the United States, Herbert Marcuse, in his book Eros and Civilization, which was first published in 1955. Now, it might surprise you to see this radical sexual movement beginning in the mid-1950s, a moment that we, in at least American culture, understand as the height of the Cold War, the height of the Red Scare, an incredibly conservative political moment. Yet this is happening at exactly the same time. And Eros connoted a communal relation among people premised equally on physical pleasure, having sex with one another, and a kind of psychic connectedness, a warm, suffusing state akin to what Freud once termed the oceanic feeling. And what he meant by that was a kind of boundlessness or oneness that was felt between the subject and the outside world. Importantly, there's no women's eros nor men's eros. It's neither gay nor lesbian nor heterosexual. It's never made specific that way. Rather, it's always simply eros, and it's proclaimed a universal human capacity. Now, we understand today universals as inherently oppressive. If you say something is true of everybody, you're generalizing and refusing their differences. But at this moment, I'm going to be arguing, instead, the universal wasn't, in fact, intended to shore up the status quo, to keep power in the hands of those who already have it, but rather understood itself as both dissident and liberatory. I'm about to show you a film by the artist Yoko Ono. It's a 1967 film called Four, and it's familiarly known as Bottoms. And you'll see why. As I let it run for a little while, note the tight camera angle, which, while not entirely obscuring the easy legibility of gender, instead obviates gender as a category, transubstantiating all human flesh into a lovely, undifferentiated invocation of that central modernist trope, the grid, right? But here, the grid made mobile, where it should be stable, made warm and soft, where it should be cold and hard, made penetrable, where it's most hysterically fenced off. For both opens itself up to the body and forecloses our habitual frames of reference. The four-part harmony of the buttocks, the four, of course, in the title, softening the hard edges of our lucidly geometric conceptual universe with a fuzzy organicism of an entirely different order. That order, according to Marcuse, is liberation literally incarnate, made bodily. Through the confusing of gender distinction, as in fuses, or the celebration, as in Four, of that erotic zone that is but minimally sexed, your ass, Marcuse haunts a resurgent body politic that is invested in regression, in the Freudian sense of a return to an original polymorphous perversity. As Marcuse put it in his Eros and Civilization, and I quote him, "The regression involved in this spread of the libido would first manifest itself as the reactivation of all our erotic zones, and consequently in a resurgence of a pregenital polymorphous sexuality and a decline of genital supremacy. The body now, in its entirety," he continues, "would become an object of cathexis, a thing to be enjoyed, an instrument of pleasure," end quote. In short, through Eros, the body is now made central again to art making, but it's not the body as we usually think of it, either an abstracted modernist body, nor is it made to conform to the way we usually think about the body, which is right in terms of gender division, gender binaries. Now, to talk of the body is to address it wholly, the sensuality of all warm flesh in all its functions and fluids. The performative is its chief, though hardly its sole mode, for performance works to harness a new relation to the body and to pleasure, a seduction towards recognizing the body, your body and other people's bodies, as vehicles of pleasure, ahead of the usual way we think about bodies, at least under capitalism, which is as an instrument of work. The broad outlines of this historical moment when sexuality switched from a private exchange to form of public dissent are very visible, yet we don't see them. If this notion of Eros as both a means of resistance and a kind of recuperation of the body strikes a familiar chord, it's of course because of the 1960s, our stereotypes of the 60s. Perhaps no other cultural moment cited the erotic as so defining, and the construction and repeated citation of the words sexual revolution, you've heard it before, in the 60s became a populist media darling. It came to infuse popular culture from Rowan and Martin's groundbreaking television variety show Laugh In to the musical Hair and O Calcutta with their nude bodies writhing on stage. But where did this instrumentalization of the erotic come from? For all its common law status, the counterintuitive marriage between sex and revolution is a remarkably unstudied affair. And I call it counterintuitive because for the bulk of human history, sex as that aspect of human behavior most singled out for social regulation and social control, and revolution, by definition, the loosening of regulation and control, worked at cross purposes. My goal in this talk, then, is to historicize the mobilization of a very particular universalizing vision of the erotic in the late Cold War as a mechanism of comprehensive social dissent, and to explore the relationship between this newly visible body and its eroticism and the subsequent advent of the sexual revolution and its kin, like second-wave feminism and queer liberation. I hope to show that it was Eros that first helped to make the body visible as inherently ideological, as inherently political and resistant. The first step, right, towards its subsequent politicization in these succeeding social movements, generating the conditions that we now assume, right, the conditions that now see the body as the ground of all forms of social liberation. The great paradox I'm going to embrace then is that it was the universalizing language of Eros that engendered the very particular anti-universalizing categories that we use today. Categories like queer or female, feminist, that now obscure its founding and formative role. As the most direct conduit to the liberatory potential of Eros, a huge percentage of art in all sorts of media between the mid-50s and the mid-60s, I'm talking painting, theater, performance, film, happenings, all of it, turned on the seduction of Eros. Many of the key artists of the period regularly used sensuous imagery and used nudity or near nudity in their work. And notably, these Eros-driven artists were both American and non. Brazilian, British, German, French, Japanese, all of them. They were gay and straight and bi. They were male and female. Indeed, the art of Eros may have been the first genuinely global art movement before pop art, right? And global, universal, not just as a theoretical construct, but as a material fact, because it was in evidence literally across the globe, across geographic and gender and sexual difference. Yet despite the common thematization of the erotic, the works of art produced by it look very different. So different, in fact, that they've never been considered together before. So what I'm going to be doing is correlating artists together, arguing that they belong to the same movement, despite the fact that they've never been lumped this way together in the past. And I'm going to argue that this rubric, Eros, is an historical category, despite the fact that it doesn't appear in any of our art history or art criticism. But it is only through Eros, I believe, that we can come to understand the simultaneous emergence of the erotic as a means of artistic engagement across a panoply of human difference, at the same moment across the globe. Let me show you another example. This is a poster made, believe it or not, in 1955. It advertises the groundbreaking exhibition in London, This Is Tomorrow at the Whitechapel Gallery. It was one of 12 such posters, and it is probably the earliest image of Eros, as I'm using it, which is to say, right, the universal body that refuses gender distinction, I found. Look at it, and you'll see that, like Marcuse's book, Eros and Civilization, the poster seems hell-bent on the erasure of gender at a historical moment that is instead widely viewed as, in fact, right, ossifying our distinctions of gender. Note how male and female here mutate into one another, making gender differentiation merely a freezing, right, of the particular moment in time and not the evocation of any essential difference. Now look at this collage by Richard Hamilton, the famous first work of pop art. This is it. It's called Just What Is It That Makes Today's Home So Different, So Appealing? That's the full title. And it is the most famous artifact of the This Is Tomorrow exhibition. And I first thing want to note that both this collage and the earlier poster were made, remember, in 1955, which is fully over a decade before Yoko Ono's Bottoms. This is really early stuff. And yet look at it. Of course, the tomorrow envisioned in this collage looks strikingly like American popular culture. It's manifestly gendered through the traditional iconography of commodity fetishism. And Hamilton's figures are both the literal and figurative products of US consumer magazines because he literally cut them out from US magazines. He didn't, a colleague of his, John McHale, did, who was then living in the US, and sent them to Hamilton. And believe me, in the drab confines of post-war Britain with its chronic shortages and its quotas, US consumer culture emerges as, right, the very theme of desirability, a recognition that commodity fetishism turns not on its first term, but its second with the full Freudian complement, not least the evocation of an absence engendering presence. But unlike so many period accounts that cast consumption as positive, as passive, and hence figured it as female, right? Passive at this moment equals female. Hamilton's collage recognizes no such gendered norm because, of course, we all know men and women both fetishize commodity. I'm going to be arguing that this skewing of the traditional structuring binaries of sexuality and gender through an overwrought, campy, performative, or citation is queer Hamilton's identity as a white British heterosexual male notwithstanding. Now, what's striking is that the drawing, the collage, was originally reproduced in the catalog just as I'm showing it to you on the screen. So if you opened up the catalog for This Is Tomorrow, this is what you'd see. It's reproduced opposite this very strange drawing. Both images, and especially the drawing, and it's striking that the drawing is almost never talked about, I was the first person to talk about it, are predictive of fuses or bottoms in their highly unusual and very early refusal of sexual and gender binaries, right? Look at it. There is, of course, gender and sexuality in both images, but in the drawing, let me ask you something. Is black penetrating white or white penetrating black? What's going where? What's male? What's female? What's hetero? What's homo? Are we looking at vaginal sex, oral sex, anal sex? You can't tell. And in the collage, there's a similar pressure on gender, wrought now through a kind of camp idiom that necessarily cites precisely the social codes it wants to denaturalize. Male and female in the collage are so ridiculously, right, overwrought, overdetermined, as to be no longer mere nature, but the self-evident orchestration of a social performance. The traditionally female domestic space now is made very male. An emblematically phallic, masculine icon, poppingly queer in his self-conscious fetishistic display. And let's not forget, the housewife is endowed with an improbably long vacuum hose. Look at her all the way at the top of the stairs. What's more, the figure of the man here was derived from a gay porn magazine called Tomorrow's Man. He was the winner of the Mr. Los Angeles bodybuilding contest, and he was reproduced in that porn magazine. And it's not irrelevant that Hamilton chooses an image drawn from gay pornography. In 1955, the very same year that Marcuse published Eros and Civilization, and Hamilton exhibited this collage, Just What Is It?, the American poet Allen Ginsberg finished his great cri de coeur, his famous poem, Howl. I'm going to give you a few lines of that poem, evidence of how close the vision of sexual fluidity, promoted by Schneemann and Marcuse and Ono and Hamilton, also surface in Ginsberg's epic-defining poem. Here's the quote. Who copulated ecstatic and insatiate with a bottle of beer, a sweetheart, a package of cigarettes, a candle, and fell off the bed and continued along the floor and down the hall and ended fainting on the wall with a vision of ultimate cunt and cum, eluding the last jism of consciousness, end quote. Now, if this excerpt strikes you as written fundamentally from a phallic perspective, sure, you're right. It certainly depends on that traditional notion of male embodiment. Still, what I find compelling is this vision of desire that tries to move fluidly between, as the poem puts it, cunt and cum, male and female, top and bottom, gay and straight. Or perhaps better said, a vision of Eros that in its ecstatic wholeness refutes such specificities and particularities. To copulate with a candle or a bottle of beer is, of course, necessarily to be penetrated, to be female or queer. Yet terms like sweetheart or last jism of consciousness are nothing if they're not traditionally normatively phallic. In terms of our contemporary identity categories, in short, the who in this poem is indecipherable. Male and female, gay and straight. Coterminous with Schneemann's vision of an open, indecipherable whiteness like that orgasmic space, but nearly a decade earlier. Howl is revolutionary in the sense of causing things to revolve, right? The original idea behind revolutionary. Such, right, that things turn over and the top becomes the bottom, and the bottom can become the top. Marcuse, Ginsberg, Hamilton, Schneemann, all of them contribute towards the breaching of the essentialized autonomous body, the body as a site outside of history. They disrupt the traditional idea that social meanings adhere to the body naturally to make them what they already are. Immobilizing the body not as a fact, but as a discursive projection. They give form to a social constructionist project. And what's remarkable here is that for theorists of this new form of embodiment, capitalism, seemingly far removed from the body, capitalism was the motor for and the key to understanding these rapid changes in the construction of the self. Howl, like Eros and Civilization, was in fact, right, a song to those consumed and spit out by industrial capitalism, then at its literal peak. Remember that the year that Howl was published, the United States government issued figures that revealed that for the very first time in US history, more people were employed as middle-class workers than in the traditional blue-collar job. Post-war America was booming. And for the first time in our history, the vast majority of our population had at least the hope of becoming economically enfranchised. As the Cold War enforced a permanent war economy, and with it receding fears of return to depression, the watchword of Western anti-communist thought was one word: affluence. Affluence was going to secure, ahead of Marxism, right, ahead of socialism, and certainly ahead of communism, the dream of a truly classless society, one that intellectuals had long nurtured. In abundance, it was thought, all people could finally get what they needed. And yet so many intellectuals at this moment, among them all the artists I've given you, viewed this development with real alarm, viewed affluence with real alarm. The capitalist wage-paying machinery, what Ginsberg actually personifies in Howl, through the pagan god Moloch. And what Marcuse meant when he used the term civilization had quite simply crushed the prospect of resistance. The very affluence that promoted the dream of a classless society had another kind of darker side, one dedicated to eliminating dissent, casting aside those unable or unwilling to feed it. It had so completely taken over political life that to imagine a system outside of corporate capitalism at this moment was to be inherently labeled a communist, or to be thought mad. The famous first lines of Howell, "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked." As Marcuse put it in Eros and Civilization, and I'm quoting him, "the very progress of civilization leads to the release of increasingly destructive forces." Destructive because economic progress thrives precisely on the control and containment of individual liberty. End quote. Howell is, if nothing else, a chronicle of the wages of these released destructive forces. It's a toll-taking. It's a body count. Howell was straightforward resistance, clear as a clarion. Ginsberg sought to craft a kind of rallying cry, a heartfelt, moving ode in opposition to the pervasive, all-seeing capitalist economy. As Ginsberg wrote of capitalism, realized in this figure of the pagan god Moloch, and I'm quoting Ginsberg here from the same poem, "Moloch, whose mind is pure machinery, Moloch, whose blood is running money, Moloch, whose love is only endless oil and stone." End quote. Of course, any resemblance to the contemporary political situation is just happenstance, just a coincidence. Richard Hamilton, living in the UK, instead adopts a kind of fugitive irony towards this culture of affluence that he could only barely imagine. His no less impassioned but vastly cooler account turns down the heat, but not the horror. A mere 4 years later, when he, using pop Madison Avenue cadences, describes global capitalism like this. I quote him, "The emphasis of the last 10 years on giving the consumer what he thinks he wants is a ludicrous exaggeration of democracy. Propaganda techniques could be exploited much more systematically by industry to mold the consumer to his own needs. As monopolistic tendencies will increase, we can expect a more systematic application of control techniques with greater power to instill the craving to consume. It will, I admit, take longer to breed desire for possessions when the objects to be consumed have not sprung directly from the subconscious of the consumer, but from the creative consciousness of advertising. But the time lag will have distinct advantages for our industries. The time lag can be used to design a consumer to the product, and the consumer can be manufactured during the product's production span." End quote. Remarkable quote, right? Above all, it was Marcuse who clarified the deep intimacy between capitalism, whether Madison Avenue or Moloch, and Eros's evocation and celebration of outlawed bodily pleasure. For the means of resistance to this Madison Avenue Moloch, I'm arguing, was in fact, right, for Ginsberg, for all of these figures, the manifold pleasures of Eros. Eros implied a society that no longer repressed the pleasure principle, a society no longer organized around the denial of our libidos, but that celebrated the libido as an end in itself, capable of countering the capitalist enslavement of the body as an instrument of work with an image of the body as an instrument of pleasure. To Marcuse, the import of Eros towards the attainment of complete human freedom could scarcely be overstated. In a society which foreclosed the prospect of resistance, Marcuse invented the term one-dimensional society to say that we can't actually get outside of the structures that control us. Eros could be the motor for a new relation to the social, one which refused the productive imperative of increasing technological capitalism in favor of concentrating on genuine human needs. And what's striking here, and the irony is thick, is that technologies had largely given us new technological advances, even today, right? Largely given us more time and more liberty to experience the pleasures of our body, to experience Eros. And yet the capitalist imperative continues to enslave, such that the desire for freedom, excuse me, the desire for freedom is sought not by working less, which is what you'd expect people who want to be free would do, but working more so as to be able to buy, for example, that red Mazda Miata, that top-down, right, signifies to your friends the very freedom from work that you signed up for another shift in order to buy. The irony's a little thick. Marcuse's Eros and Civilization, like the conceit of Eros itself, was an attempt to understand how to move out from the Cold War's multiple repressions, how to fully understand and embrace the ostensible freedoms that only 2 years after Senator Joe McCarthy's downfall were finally coming to the fore. But these freedoms were a Mephistophelian bargain, for freedom had been purchased at the price of an ever-increasing affluence, which meant, of course, that freedom had been won only by agreeing to work more under ever-tightening degrees of social surveillance and control. Eros thus becomes an allegory for the pursuit of a non-productive, pleasure-driven life. It's pure pleasure, which is to say it's uncommodifiable. You can't buy it, you can't sell it. It's got a use value, to use Marx's language, but no exchange value. A rare instance of desire not tinged with the impulse of accumulation. You can't accumulate erotic desire. It's there, but it doesn't, you can't store it, you can't bank it. And remarkably, it's as something that is exclusively experiential, it actively led away from participation in capitalist spectacle, for capitalism, which always wants to substitute commodity pleasure for sexual pleasure, buying that Miata, not having sex, right, was inimical to its goal. For Marcuse, as well as for other advocates of Eros at the time, it was thus a route towards a deeper kind of freedom, and moreover, unlike traditional commodified pleasures, commodified pleasures, Eros didn't attempt to dictate in advance what that pleasure was going to be or feel like. Look at contemporary advertising. It tells you at the beginning, right, the minute you look at the ad, what kind of pleasure you're going to get. It makes the object you were supposed to buy and the pleasure equivalent, right? But not this. This Eros is messy, unpredictable, authentic, mad, seditious, all aspects of genuine human freedom, and all, significantly, the major tropes of the art of this moment, of works like Fuses, or Howl, or Just What Is It, and especially this work. In a church off Washington Square Park in Manhattan, in the spring of 1964, Carolee Schneemann orchestrated a performance that came to be a touchstone of an Eros-based art. She called it Meet Joy. I'm showing you one of the photographs of the original New York performance in 1964. It had earlier been performed in London and Paris at free expression festivals. Imagine, if you can, this scene. A large group of near-naked young men and women writhe on the floor of a crowded hall. The audience is just a few feet away. Originally, they were to be naked, but of course, U.S. law didn't permit it. They paint one another's bodies, playfully clamor over one another with abandon, carry and caress while playing with chicken carcasses, sausages, and fish. Waste paper and paint cling to their bodies. Schneemann has described the performance, I love this phrase, as flesh jubilation. And she tells us that Meet Joy had the character, this is her quote, of an erotic rite, excessive, indulgent, a celebration of flesh as material. Its propulsion is towards the ecstatic, the orgiastic, shifting and turning between tenderness, wildness, precision, abandon. Physical equivalences, she continues, are enacted as psychic and imagistic streams in which the layered elements mesh and gain intensity by the energy of the audience. The audience seated on the floor as close to the performance as possible, encircling it, resonating with it. Our proximity heightened the sense of commonality, transgressing the polarity, end quote. I've quoted her at such length because I think her very language emblematizes this view of Eros, not simply in its quasi-orgiastic propulsion, but also in the degree that it implicates the audience, actively seeking their participation, seducing them into, in her own words, transgressing the polarity, right? Not only the polarity between the observed and the observer, but also all those other polarities that structure our society, male and female, straight and gay, clothed and nude, active and passive, all keyed to the reproduction, right, of traditional power in which, right, always the first term is privileged. Meat Joy is so notably untroubled by gender or sexual difference that male and female are one pure body. She calls it physical equivalences are enacted. And of course, it's not entirely unrelated that sausages and fish are part of the elements of this performance. Meat Joy is testament to the fact that before the notion of sex was the ground for difference, Eros was the cradle of our commonality. Such ecstatic refusal of difference was radical at the time, but its radical politics have curiously been blunted by an identity-based sexual revolution that in fact post-dated it. So we've lost the ability to see this moment because of subsequent political developments in our thinking about sexuality. Remember that the interlude that I'm talking about here, 1955 to the late 1960s, is the coldest stretch of the Cold War, one in which the fraught relation between Eros and Thanatos was no longer merely academic. The same year as One-Dimensional Man and Meat Joy was performed, 1964, also brings, right, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and the beginning of the full-scale war in Vietnam. Kennedy was assassinated while both works were being written. In short, Schneemann and Marcuse's plea for return to Eros was very much cast as an intervention, for the threat posed at this moment by the death drive was all too real. And note something here. Eros is an eroticization of the entire body, not just the genitals. Indeed, Marcuse understood the focus on the genitals as actually a reduction of our potential, a restriction of it under, right, the law of capitalism to a certain population, to a certain part of the body, to a certain time of day. Marcuse argued that genital sexuality was being promoted by capital as a means of containing the much more free-floating and unproductive, even disruptive tendencies of Eros, holding out the promise of heterosexual missionary position sex once a week, late at night, promoted the illusion of freedom and pleasure in an everyday life that was instead, right, filled with the conditions of enslavement. In fact, in One-Dimensional Man, Marcuse understands even the act of sex itself as diminished if it's made entirely genital. He wanted instead for us to feel with our entire bodies, all the surfaces of our skin. He says, for example, compare lovemaking in a meadow and in an automobile, on a lover's walk outside the town walls, and on a Manhattan street. I always wondered about who's making love on Manhattan streets, but anyway. In the former case, the environment partakes of and invites the libido and tends to be eroticized. The libido transcends beyond the immediate erotic zones. He thus curiously viewed the increasingly sexual society of the 1960s, the society of the sexual revolution, which, of course, we've tended to understand as liberating. He instead called it repressive. And he said it was repressive because the unleashing of repressed sexual energies only served to give the illusion of freedom from repression, unlike true Eros. So I'm showing you Yayoi Kusama's work called Peep Show, Endless Love Show. And it also proceeds from this idea that the body signifies in a way that cannot be circumscribed by mere genital sexuality. It's an hexagonal mirrored room, and Kusama asked the visitors to poke their heads through the walls. You can see some of the visitors doing that. Where illuminated in flashing colored lights, they see their own reflections endlessly regressing, mingled with glimpses of other visitors doing exactly the same thing, all amidst a loop, endless loop, of Beatles love songs. This is a short video of the room, so this is what the camera looks like when you see it. It's just this Beautiful space, and then you would see other heads as it went through. What's striking here is this is a peep show of a different order, focused not on genitalia or sexual acts, but on the intersubjective, on relationality with others. Such relation of mutuality is cast as endless love because the self implies the other, indeed requires the other to come to consciousness of itself in a relation of mutuality. She had initially actually wanted the box to flash the words love and sex in infinite kaleidoscopic regression, but it proved technically impossible. So instead what she did was, as you walked up to the box, she handed you a button that said love forever. Now, the theorist Maurice Merleau-Ponty wrote a posthumously published essay called The Chiasm, published in 1964, the same year as Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man. And in it, Merleau-Ponty writes, "My body as a visible thing is contained within the full spectacle of other visible bodies. My seeing body subtends this visible body. There is reciprocal insertion and intertwining of the one with the other." End quote. So, for Merleau-Ponty, intersubjectivity is intercorporeality, which is another way of saying that seeing is sex. The seen and the seeing intertwined, such that vision, and this is classically Merleau-Ponty, is touch, and touch is vision. Kusama's endless love show creates and exposes a fully embodied seeing. Also in 1966, at the 33rd Venice Biennale, denied an invitation to exhibit, Kusama here ordered 1,500 mirrored balls, and in her familiar guerrilla style, set them up in the Biennale's lawn in a work she called Narcissus Garden. Dressed in a reflective gold kimono, she proceeded to sell the balls to visitors for $2 a pop until the Italian authorities closed her down, saying in their citation to her that it is, quote, inappropriate to sell art like hot dogs or ice cream at the Venice Biennale. Apparently it's okay to sell art for millions of dollars at the Venice Biennale, but you can't sell it for $2 a pop. Despite its utopian promise, this self-other relationship was no simple matter. From Hegel's master-slave to Lacanian analysis, it's always been a relationship that was premised on difference, on hierarchy and conflict. The idea that the self, right, is always in struggle, attempting supremacy over the other. For Kusama, Eros recast that self-other relationship on grounds other than the desire for mastery, remodeling it in terms of equality and identification. But it couldn't do it alone. It needed an aesthetic intervention. And so Kusama advocated a Zen-inflected quieting of the self, not through the passive act of meditation, but through the active leveling of all distinctions in an infinite web, and this is a bit bizarre, of polka dots, as if her infinity web dot paintings had moved off the wall and into the world. I'm going to show you a film of this. First thing, a shot of Kusama's self-obliteration at the Brooklyn Bridge of 1967. It was one of a number of such performances organized all over the world. They were always guerrilla, but carefully she notifies the press, right, when they're happening. And the dancers show up, and to music being played, they strip off their clothes, and Kusama comes out there and paints polka dots on their body. That's the performance. And they were always called self-obliterations, and they included places like the Garden of the Museum of Modern Art. For each performance, Kusama wanted to make clear that with the polka dots, you could transform specific bodily differences into an overarching bodily similarity. Everybody looking roughly the same. And that's, she calls, a self-obliteration. And of course, that self-obliteration had a distinctly political cast in the context of regular protests against the Vietnam War, not only in terms of the familiar substitution of the erotic for aggression, but also towards specifying the causes of warfare in a misrecognition of bodily differences as signifying more powerfully than our cross-identification. I'm going to show you a short segment of that film, 1967, Self-Obliteration, and notice in it the Eros-fueled leveling of all distinctions through a web of polka dots. interspecies even, right? There's not going to be a human-animal distinction. Everything's going to be exactly the same. Notice how she's taking those polka dots and letting them go out into the water. So even nature becomes the same. Notice also the distinct reference to the Vietnam War in her costume and her hat. She starts painting dots or placing dots onto the leaves of the water lilies. And then she makes a painting of these polka dots and she submerges it so the polka dots start to float up in the water, carried out into the world. And then she moves them directly onto the body. For those of us old enough to remember Laughing, this is where it comes from. And there's male bodies, male bodies with male bodies, female bodies with female bodies, male and female bodies together, all of it, right, covered with polka dots. Filmed so carefully that you almost lose sight of gender. You can't tell the gender of the person. Kusama wrote in a press release for her famous 1968 naked demonstration anatomic explosion on Wall Street the following words: "Stock is fraud. Stock means nothing to the working man. Stock is a lot of capitalist bullshit. Obliterate Wall Street men with polka dots. Obliterate Wall Street men with polka dots on their naked bodies. Obliterate. Be in. Be naked. Be naked. Be free, be naked." End quote. I'm now going to show you just a few more works. One is a Vito Acconci performance of 1973 called Open. In it, he laboriously trained himself to speak without ever closing his mouth. He wanted to speak with his mouth entirely open all the time. Now try that. Try talking without closing your mouth. It's almost impossible. But he did it because he wanted to reverse the usual gendered terms and be always, as a male, open and penetrable. Listen to him carefully here. Come inside. I'm open to you. I'll stay open. I won't close. I won't trap you. I won't hold you in. When I'm open, anything can happen in he inside me. Freedom. Freedom. No, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean to close. Open. I don't want to close. I'll stay open for you. Wide open. when, in 1968, the Brazilian artist Ligia Pape organized the first public performance of this work, which she entitled Divisores, she sought to see just such a communal eros, paradoxically turning not on nudity, but on dress. The title is ironic because what Dividers most powerfully articulates is, in fact, human connectedness. A sea of people dressed in a giant white cloth parading down a street in Rio de Janeiro. Dividers was one articulation of an art of eros, communal, sensuous, performative, and uncommodifiable. You couldn't buy this, you couldn't sell it. The public enactment of resistance to the individual, explicitly featuring the children of the favelas or the shanty towns along with a range of others. Pape literally covers the defining distinctions among people, distinctions like race and gender and social class, in favor of a communalism that acknowledges differences, after all their heads poke through, but doesn't let it interrupt a larger sense of commonality. I can't really treat all the artists of Eros of this period, which makes which makes Eros's utter absence from art history all the more striking. We could, for example, talk about this work, Cy Twombly's scatological paintings of the early 1960s, replete with their numerous phallic and vaginal forms, mediated by buttocks, look carefully, excreting shit-colored paint, evoking that least gendered of all our somatic functions. I could talk about Franz Erhard Walter's phallic wearable sculptures. I could talk about Brazilian artist Elio Oiticica's nests, which were environments that invited people to walk in and close the door, and you could even have sex inside. MoMA had to start policing them because when the nests were first shown, people were actually having sex inside in the museum, and the museum said, well, we can't do that. I could also show you this work by Lygia Clark, also Brazilian, the I and You body clothing series, which clothed the participants in thick plastic overalls lined with different materials intended to evoke gender. There's steel wool and fibers for the man's suit, and smooth plastic and cloth for the woman's, but she specified that the suits were to be donned without regard to the wearer's actual gender. So you could wear a male suit or a female suit, depending on how chance hit. These suits are connected at the navel by an underwater breathing tube. Responding to our privileging of the visual, reading the body, ahead of the experience of it, Clark blocks sight, right? You can see that, and blocks hearing, making an art that is now exclusively tactile, bodily, Merleau-Ponty's equation of sight and touch, the I in you now registering entirely in the body. In a slight variation on the same theme, she then reversed the equation and created, as she does here, a kind of optical machine that makes the gaze palpably intersubjective, or makes the body aware of itself through the imprint of the other non-body. But Yoko Ono's, and here's another piece where she just took a simple band and made two people's hands touch one another. But it's this piece, 1964, Yoko Ono's cut piece, that predicts the direction the art of Eros would take into the late 1960s and through the 70s, and why. Cut piece shows the artist formally dressed and seated on stage. Scissors are passed through the audience, and one by one, viewers are invited to come up and cut off a piece of Ono's clothing until she sits completely nude. Here, nakedness, under Eros, a sign of playful, sensuous, and equitable interchange, to quote Schneemann, becomes instead the political marker of a gendered script ending too often, let's not lose sight of the fact, in violence. By 1968, Ono would direct in the notes for her work entitled simply Rape, that, quote, a cameraman will chase a girl on the street with a camera persistently until he corners her in an alley, and if possible, until she then falls into a prone position. I've seen that work. I don't know whether it was staged, but it doesn't look like it was staged. It looks like the woman is genuinely terrified. An even more telling index of change is Schneemann's 1975 performance, Interior Scroll, which would come to supplant Meet Joy as her defining work. For Interior Scroll, Schneemann comes on stage nude, covered in paint, and slowly and deliberately pulls a thin paper scroll from her vagina, which she reads aloud. It's an attack, highly gendered, on her by a male structuralist filmmaker. Let me close by simply noting that shortly after the Stonewall riots, a lesbian was asked by a reporter in the Village Voice what she hoped those riots would have accomplished. She replied, "We'll be queer," I'm quoting her, "we'll be queer as long as you continue to be straight. Then I hope, finally, we can all just be people together," end quote. Her formulation sounding so presciently like our contemporary queer dream was even at this, the triumphantly dawning moment of gay and lesbian liberation, already a kind of wistful backward glance, a nostalgic look to a time over a decade in the past when commonality still triumphed over difference and identity, to where to be progressive entailed not to be different, but to be in communion of the deepest and most intimate kind. It was a moment when a straight man, like Richard Hamilton, could paint a painting, reading, "Slip it to me." The painting's title is Epiphany, and somehow actually mean it. Or as Ginsberg wrote at the end of Howl, in one of that poem's few valedictory lines, "O victory, forget your underwear, we're free." Thank you.